Canada trial lawyer Roy Millen of Blake Castles in Graydon will survey recent developments and discuss his personal experience as project counsel. Please welcome Roy Millen.
Thank you very much. So this is more about development of projects, which is more an issue in Canada than it is in New York, I suspect. But a lot of the concepts that I'm going to talk about apply to a wider range of regulatory arenas. Social license is one of those not quite legal concepts that has legal implications and has a tremendous amount of business implications. And if you've followed Keystone XL or any of the other developments in Canada at all, you'll know that the concept has had a lot of business implications for a variety of companies. So that's the topic. And I'm going to talk about what it is and where it comes from. The history of it is not terribly long. It's become much more talked about lately, and it plays out in a variety of arenas. So first, there isn't any firm definition of what social license is. A variety of people have talked about it. It's talked about in the academic community to a minor extent. It's mostly talked about in the business community. It was coined by an academic slash business person. Some people claim back in the 70s, and the most firm date is in the 1990s. The essence of it is support from local communities for a project that's going to affect them. And so I'm from Vancouver. Vancouver has a significant mining business community. A lot of the mining that is done from the Vancouver business mining community is not done in Vancouver. In fact, there aren't any mines in Vancouver. It's all done elsewhere in Canada and overseas. I have clients who operate in South America, all across North America, in Africa, and in Asia. And so there are legal issues that those clients have to face, and we can give advice on that. But the social license concept comes out of the local communities where the mine or whatever other development is going to be located. And so the concept includes not just sort of unanimous support. You're never going to get unanimous support. You don't necessarily need approval from local communities, depending on what implications or what legal levers they have to pull. And when I say local, yes, it is local, although you're going to have external influences on that local support. So social license is rather amorphous. And similarly, how do you get it? There isn't, it's not a regulatory process that you can follow through, although I'm going to come back to the regulatory process, but there's not a single process that you can follow through and say, okay, if I do 1, 2, 3, I'm going to get it. It's going to vary by project, it's going to vary by industry and by community. Governments can be helpful in that regard, not necessarily. I'll refer to some cases later on where governments take the position that, take positions contrary to projects because they feel, for a variety of reasons, that the social license required has not been obtained. And regulatory agencies similarly will sometimes help in getting you there, and sometimes they won't. The perspectives of regulators on this is kind of interesting. Regulators for a long time have seen themselves and still see themselves legitimately as advancing the public interest. And so one of the, a variety, because social license has been talked about, a variety of regulators got together not long ago to talk about what social license means. And it seems to me that at least this group wasn't fond of the concept and how it is used. So this was the outcome from their forum. It said the term social license becomes shorthand for a demand from self-defined interest groups to be consulted and granted effective veto power over regulatory approvals or mitigation conditions prior to any final project approval. Obviously, regulators aren't happy when they're being subject to other people who think that they have the right to determine the way things go. And that's understandable. Nobody who thinks they have jurisdiction wants to be told that they don't. On the other hand, when you're in the position of the company trying to move something forward, it's difficult to win friends when you tell people that they have no say in the matter. And so the whole concept of social license revolves around inclusion, not exclusion. So the result, and this is again quoting from the Regulators Forum, the result is a challenge to regulatory procedures designed to focus on proposed projects or to interpret the value of any given infrastructure project in satisfying future supply and demand needs. And so the regulators would say, look, we do this is our job, we don't need you, essentially. But the structure, the structure of decision-making now and the amount of information flow that is out there now and the desire of people to be involved is such that you can't entirely rely on a regulatory process and assume that that's going to be enough. So companies more and more are going out into communities on their own with and without regulatory support in a coordinated fashion with the regulatory strategy, but not exclusively relying on the regulatory strategy. And you need a few things. You need to know what you're talking about. You need lots of time. Regulatory processes have typically a structured timeline, and you've got to go, you file your application, you go through a hearing, you go through a decision-making process, and at the end of the day, you're going to have a decision, hopefully positive. Social license doesn't work like that. Social license involves going to talk to people. Well, they might not be home. You might set up a meeting, they might not come. It's very much less structured, and you can't rely on timelines. So you got to allow yourself sufficient time. You also have to be transparent. People, it is easy, and you see this frequently, it is easy for people to dig up what they think are facts and post it on a website. And it goes around and around and around. It'll go viral if it's bad, and if it's exciting. And that's not helpful to you. So the providing clear information from your perspective, and that's factual and that can be backed up and it's simple and easy enough to understand, is going to be important. Not just about what the actual project is, whether you're building a factory in the middle of the community or you're doing whatever other work that you're doing, but also the regulatory process so that people understand this is their avenue, this is what the legal requirements are, and this is how people can get involved if they want to get involved. You have to figure out who your audience is. Back to the concept of what is social license, well, it's the local community. And who leads the local community? You have to figure that out. It's going to depend on where the community is and who's there, and it's going to vary. And you need to demonstrate to those people who are going to be affected that they're not just going to be affected negatively. They're going to have some positive benefits, whether there's local jobs, whether there's scholarships or there's contracts or there's, they're going to get clean water because you're building a water plant. There's going to be a lot of, that's going to vary by project, but nobody wants to hear that they get all the burden and none of the benefits, because if they hear that, they're going to oppose. Variety of people have rights in this scenario. When you're going over land, Canada, the US, and lots of other countries have pretty healthy protection for land rights, and so there's often a procedure for those rights holders to be protected, and so you have to go through those, and though that will have a regulatory component to it. And then there will be other rights that may not be quite so tied and may not be as concretely dealt with in regulatory processes. And so a lot of the work that I do relates to Aboriginal groups in Canada, First Nations who have constitutional rights and whose rights have really been described primarily via common law decisions, court decisions over the past 20 years, and an increasing number of court decisions. And so figuring out who has rights and what those rights are is important. And it's influenced to a degree by international law as well. You've got the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that provides for free, prior, and informed consent by local communities for projects, which sounds like a veto, but if you read longer than those 5 words, then you see that it isn't. But it's used as a potential tool. Local and municipal governments, I'll come back to a couple of cases. Canada has a federal, provincial, municipal layers of government similar to the United States, and local governments are often not as fond of projects as the provincial and federal governments are because they don't see their tax revenue. And so they will, if they believe that their local constituents and if it's going to play popularly in the local voting crowd, local governments have resources. They do have a tax base, so they can launch, and they sometimes have internal legal counsel, and so they can launch proceedings against projects. And there's a couple of examples there. One, Burnaby is a suburb of Vancouver, and launched a series of lawsuits in a series of courts against Kinder Morgan's proposed pipeline through that city and a bunch of other cities. Have not been successful thus far, but have caused some challenges to the project. And likewise, Canadian Pacific Railway has land in Vancouver that is currently rail land, or has been rail land for many, many years, and they would like to build condos on it. The city opposed that and took them all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada and succeeded. And so eventually CP sold the land because they weren't going to use it for rail anymore. So you can see that local governments do have pretty significant influence over the way projects can go, and they can effectively stop projects in some cases. Likewise, environmental issues. In the case of pipeline going across, proposed pipeline to go across northern British Columbia, some of the First Nations are very concerned about the impacts of oil spills, as have occurred in the past, as you may know. And so they have brought cases that have set aside permits that have been granted to the proponent. The one cited on the slide there, and another more recent case. And then doesn't have to be Indigenous rights. You get local ratepayers who want to be able to drink clean water, and so they will rally their local government to challenge, in that case, the use of an old quarry as a landfill for toxic waste, that the company had engineering studies to say would be safe, but the local government managed to convince the judge that it wasn't necessarily safe. Those are, I guess, in advance, some of the consequences of not having, those are the issues that can arise, and some of the consequences of not having social license. Essentially, it drives up litigation, and there's a bunch of examples on that slide of, so Site C is an energy dam, hydroelectric dam. The Prosperity Mine is a mine, obviously, and Molten Contracting was a forestry operation. Githatla is a pipeline, and the Prince Edward County is a wind farm. So all of those, not all of those cases succeeded, many of them did, and in those cases the proponent had a project, they thought it was viable, had financing for it, they had all of the engineering required, and they got, in all of those cases, or in almost all of those cases, they got the regulatory approvals required from the public regulator, from the government, and then people challenged them. And so the legal authority was not sufficient once people who were, in most cases or almost all cases, local to the projects were very concerned and went to court. Those are not the only kinds of challenges you can get. There's an older case in Canada about a secondary picketing operation Daishawa was a forestry company operating in northern Alberta, was trying to deal with the local First Nation, was not succeeding, and so the local First Nation named the Lubicon Cree. They had some friends in southern Canada, in Toronto, and those friends of the Lubicon instituted a boycott of customers of Daishawa, so people who were buying Daishawa's products, paper products. They picketed, not to block access, but they'd stand outside the pizza store and they'd say, do you know that pizza store is buying paper from a company that is logging against the First Nations consent? And it was an incredibly effective campaign, to the point that Daishawa sued them, and they won a defamation case with damages of $1. The court said that the common law should not erect barriers to expression by consumers where the purpose of the expression is to persuade the listener to exercise his or her economic power in a way that challenges a corporation's position on economic and public policy issues. So essentially, the case was nominally successful and essentially unsuccessful. And so the risks of the risks of not having the social license are significant, and the use of legal means to get there aren't always successful. How does it relate to the law? Well, the regulatory process is part of it, and a lot of what happens in these cases is people go to court after they're unhappy with the regulatory process, and so typically what we work with clients is to design to ensure that the regulatory process is inclusive, it's participatory, it's open, people have an opportunity to be heard. Once it's a credible process, then the result is more legitimate and is less likely to be challenged. That requires a sort of coordinated strategy. People have to be willing to consider change. That's a hard thing, but usually you'll have an engineer who'll come in and say, I have designed this box and I want it to be that way. And somebody else will say, well, we don't like it that way, and that's too bad. If you go through the process with, this is my project and this is the only way it will be, people will be unhappy with that. There needs to be a way for people to have an influence on it. And often, governments will encourage the sharing of revenue with local communities. There is the UN Global Compact, which is a voluntary, non-governmental sign-up, essentially, with 10 standards on it. And there's a variety of legislation that is coming through, partly connected to the anti-corruption movement and partly connected to this notion of ensuring that people do get social license in their project development. And finally, like I say, balancing the notion of benefits and impacts so that the people who are most affected are also getting some of the benefits of projects in their territory. So that is where social license comes in. Thank you very much.